Guys, you won't believe what just happened to me. So I recently decided to stop evangelizing Sonic the Hedgehog for a couple of minutes and stop by at this local drinkery for a cup of chocolate milk. And when I got here, I was grabbed by the bartender and given a copy of Zool for the SNES. Now, being the stand-up citizen that I am, I calmly spat in the face of this ninja bartender, broke the cartridge in half, and politely did some maniacal laughing before stopping and explaining that I'm just a bit more of a Book of Genesis guy. Anyway, after some verbal sparring which involved haranguing each other's mothers because, well, you gotta do that, I told him that unlike Sonic the Hedgehog, ninjas haven't been cool since the Clinton administration. And that's when things got weird, because he got uncharacteristically quiet and just started tending bar again. I guess it just goes to show you guys, harassing people about your opinions until they believe you half-heartedly is the way to go. He's standing right behind me, isn't he? Released in 1992, Zool is a 2D platformer for the Commodore Amiga. The game revolves around its titular gremlin on a quest to become a ninja as he travels across several worlds loaded with baddies, fruit, and collectibles waiting to be nabbed. Prior to its release, Zool was heavily marketed as a Sonic the Hedgehog killer due to its emphasis on speed-based action. Rifling through a few of the ads from the time, you could tell that the game's developers, Gremlin Graphics, were really out for blood and that they were interested in trying to cement the character as the de facto mascot for the Amiga. However, despite strong reviews for the Amiga release of the game, Zool wasn't really destined to stay an exclusive and would make its way onto a variety of other consoles such as the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, which happens to be the version that I'll be reviewing today and was published by GameTech. Now, I've never played through Zool before, but I am familiar with the character due to reading about him online back in high school and seeing this game for sale at retro game stores all the time. Zool kinda reminds me of characters like Bonk or Bubsy in the sense that while I didn't play through their games until much later, I have a weird attachment to the characters due to seeing them everywhere when I was getting into retro gaming. And seeing as the character was intended to compare with Sonic the Hedgehog, my favorite gaming character of all time, I was pretty excited to play through this one. But does it hold up? Because while Zool's Amiga release got good reviews and a sequel, it's not like anyone's really done anything meaningful with the character since the 90s, which makes me a little worried for how well his game will fare on the Super Nintendo. While the Amiga has its fans and is a console I'd honestly love to dive into the catalog of, the fact that Zool didn't continue to get sequels on other hardware makes me worried that his first adventure may not stack up when compared to the platforming competition on other consoles. And that's not a knock on any Amiga or Zool fans out there. It's just that Sega and Nintendo's 16-bit hardware has some really steep competition when it comes to platformers. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What do you consider to be a retro game? I recently saw a poll that said that games need to be at least 20 years old before they can be considered retro, and it made me curious what you guys, as well as other people I interact with regularly in general, consider to be retro. For me, I have always been really liberal with my use of the term, and I honestly don't care for what is or isn't considered retro, outside of the game and console in question needing to be at least a few years or a generation old. For example, I viewed something like the PS2 or GameCube as retro from as early as 2010 due to those consoles not really being available in stores at the time, as well as myself coming into an age where I was feeling nostalgic for that hardware. And these days, I consider stuff like the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii as retro for the same reason. Whichever way you cut it, I don't think there's really a right or wrong answer to this question, and I get how a lot of people may think that the PS2 isn't retro yet, or that I'm out of my mind for suggesting that the Xbox 360 is retro despite it coming out 15 years ago. I just thought it'd be cool to hear what everyone else thought of this since, well, my channel is technically a retro gaming one and stuff. Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Zool takes place across 7 different worlds, with each of them containing a different theme, such as a candy land, a music world, or a toy room. In each of the levels, you're tasked with collecting a set number of that stage's pickup that's shown on the bottom left of the screen, before following the arrow next to it in order to reach an exit. From there, it's just a matter of playing through each of the world's 4 stages, fighting the boss at the end of that last one, and then rinsing and recycling that process on the next level. Aside from the genre staples of running and jumping, Zool has the ability to throw projectiles at his enemies in order to eliminate them, and can even perform a spinning attack while in midair. He also has the ability to do a power slide, which allows him to travel underneath spiked areas and is about as much fun as doing dolphin dives in some of the older Call of Duties. Zool also happens to be a quick little gremlin who blasts off at full speed from the slightest tilt of the D-pad. A quirk that honestly leads to him feeling pretty hard to control, and that's sure to make players approach these levels all the more cautiously. If you compare the movement and physics of a game like Zool to Sonic the Hedgehog, it's night and day. Part of what makes Sonic's 2D Genesis games so fun to play is the amount of control you have over the character's movement, and how the physics of that movement operate within the confines of a fairly realistic but greatly exaggerated understanding of concepts like acceleration and gravity. But Zool's more like Flubber doing his own thing. Honestly though, the game's central idea of being a 2D collect-a-thon sounds alright on paper, but fails to live up to its potential in execution. I feel like Zool may have been better suited as a game with a simpler objective, such as simply trying to reach a goal as opposed to being a game that wants players to traverse every nook and cranny of its levels for otherwise meaningless pickups and getting lost in the process.
We lost, we f***ing super lost, man!
And yeah, that's probably gonna end up happening to you at least a couple of times when you're playing through the game, because levels like to recycle assets and seemingly some of their layouts, leading to things becoming a confusing and frustrating hall of mirrors for the player. This is made worse by the fact that the game encourages, if not vaguely forces, exploration onto the player by throwing an increasing number of dead ends your way as the game progresses. And the most you'll likely get out of exploring these stages is the opportunity to score more of that level's pickups that are needed to complete the level. But in my playthrough, I never really had an issue of collecting enough of them to beat the stage without needing to stop and explore to begin with. In fact, the only reason I ever stopped to explore the stages to begin with was because the game either forced me to, I had either gotten lost trying to find the exit, or because the path that contained the exit was obscured behind a hidden wall. Which was really annoying, by the way, as the game doesn't really do much to hint at this being a thing. I even went as far as to track down a copy of the game's SNES manual on the Internet Archive to see if they mentioned it there, and nope, nothing. Though the manual did mention that as a valued GameTech customer, I could be eligible for a free introductory membership to CompuServe. So that's cool. Anyway, the game even kinda teases you into thinking that it's gonna be a laid-back linear adventure by having the first stage or two of each world start off with a fairly straightforward and alright linear layout, before starting to sprinkle in mazes and gimmicks as the levels progress. Take for instance level 1-4, which has a Willy Wonka-esque chocolate river gimmick that makes Zool move slower than molasses and takes away your ability to jump unless you're at the edge of a platform. I know I was complaining about how fast this character was a minute or two ago, but that didn't mean to tie anchors to his legs and take away his ability to jump. It's almost as if one of the devs was playing Sonic the Hedgehog and wasn't really impressed until he got to Labyrinth Zone, where he went full Bradley Cooper in A Star Is Born over the slow-moving, trudging gameplay and decided to include it in this game. However, I don't think that level gimmicks are necessarily even a bad thing. In fact, games like Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze show that when done right, and with a gimmick that isn't teeth-grindingly invasive, they can actually make for a fun and unique experience. I guess one of my main issues with stuff like that here though is that these gimmicks provide a diversion from the game's standard mode of play by making things worse. And that's not to say that Zool's baseline gameplay was anything to write home about to begin with. As I mentioned earlier, movement feels way too sensitive due to the lack of acceleration, and the inclusion of a projectile attack seems like a good idea, but can sometimes be frustrating due to how hard it is to actually hit some enemies when you're in mid-air.
Come on! Come on!
Plus, some of the controls and physics make little to no sense. For example, Zool slides down inclines automatically, which isn't that bad in and of itself, but can get frustrating when there's an enemy on said incline. Plus, you can't even run up inclines in the game to begin with. Instead, you have to keep jumping up them in a way that quickly grows annoying. It kinda reminds me of trying to force your way up a steep hill in Super Mario 64, only you're required to do that in order to progress in this game. And while we're on the subject of jumping, there's a ton of moments where you'll need to basically take a leap of faith and hope that you won't land on a spike or enemy that was just off screen. It also doesn't help that the hit detection feels a bit too sensitive when it comes to obstacles, as doing stuff like walking into the side of vertically placed spikes can damage you just as much as falling on top of them would. It just feels off. Zool does have some pretty great graphics though. Each of the game's characters are colorfully designed and well detailed, and the game honestly has some great parallax scrolling going on in the backgrounds. It feels layered and alive, and even works in some foreground elements to great effect in a couple of its stages without slowing the game down, which is something that the game's competition Sonic 1 and 2 couldn't do. Plus, with unique enemies and pickups in each of the game's worlds, there's no denying that Gremlin Graphics did a great job building the world of Zool. However, while Zool looks good on a technical level, the actual implementation of these graphics leaves a bit to be desired. While the level of detail and layering on display here is impressive, it's also a bit overstimulating due to how fast you move. There's also something to be said about the game's color palette, which tends to use darker and more saturated colors in a way that I found a bit too contrasty and jarring for my liking. There's nothing inherently wrong with using a darker color palette, I suppose, but I just feel like it obfuscates the designs of the on-screen sprites and makes things a bit harder for the player to process in real time. There are also instances when colors really clash with each other, such as in the background of the fruit-themed level, which doesn't feel right from a color theory point of view. Going with a lighter, paler color palette may have provided a solution to this issue too, as it would have meant that those contrasting colors were less saturated and may have blended together a bit better. As far as Zool's music goes, it isn't terrible and actually has a few memorable songs that sound great coming out of an SNES. I do have to point out that the game tends to use sounds that try to be, well, a bit too oriental though, for lack of a better term. And while that makes some sense due to the game starring a ninja and stuff, it also feels kinda off given the fact that outside of that, the game has nothing to do with Japan. While kinda weird and something that probably hasn't aged all that well, it's mostly downplayed, seems innocent enough, and stands out more as a relic in its composition than anything. Parts of this game's soundtrack are really catchy though, and the music in general carries a really light and cartoony vibe to it. If you guys remember that Vapor song Turning Japanese from back in the 80s, it's a bit like that, or how movies like Rush Hour love to play with Eastern motifs.
I'm just showing him how to take a gun from a suspect.
And I'm not even saying whether or not that's a good or a bad thing, or whether or not it's offensive, because I honestly don't have an answer there. What I can say though is that it's part of the game's soundtrack, and that if you aren't a fan of that sort of thing, it's something worth knowing about. Something that's actually pretty cool about Zool's music though is that it can actually be disabled from the game's options menu when you boot it up, which feels decidedly modern, as games didn't always offer stuff like that back in the day. So does Zool hold up? Well, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to go with no for this one, as there really wasn't anything about the game that really grabbed me. I get that this game has its fans and that there are people that grew up loving this game, but for me personally, I just found the level designs to be a bit lacking and the movement to be a bit too stiff and fast for my liking. While the game itself isn't bad per se and may have even been pretty impressive back in the day, I think that Zool hasn't aged that well by proxy of there being that many other platformers for the Super Nintendo that are worth playing through instead. I also feel like the game's marketing may have ultimately hurt the game for me, as selling it as a Sonic the Hedgehog killer made it hard for me not to compare the two, with Zool mostly being unable to compete with Sega's Blue Blur. And that's not to say I went into this game not wanting to like it either, because I see the appeal that a game like Zool must have had for people back in the day, and because I'm genuinely glad that this game recently got a re-release for those fans. While I myself didn't like or particularly care for this game, it's awesome that there are people out there who did and can replay it now, and I genuinely have no issue with them for liking it. It's kinda like how I enjoy games like The Karate Kid for NES. We all just have different tastes in games, and that's part of what makes talking about them in videos and stuff interesting. Anyway, with that said and done, that brings us to the end of this video. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and do all that YouTube social engagement stuff, as well as leave an answer to the question of the day over in the comments if you haven't already. On top of that, if you have a game you'd love to see me review in the future, feel free to let me know what it is by messaging me over on Twitter or Instagram. You can find me on both those respective sites by searching for @NichePlays on Twitter and Instagram, or by following the links down in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video, and that if you do end up playing one of the versions of Zool, that you have a good time doing so. So yeah. Bye.